Hello everyone, and my name is Jiao Gao, and today I'm going to talk about open source. And uh, Open source is a very important part on internet. Nowadays, more and more people start to using open source software. So you may wondering, what is the open source? So the open source is the software as intellectual property and is also have open source software in the freeware. Um, Open source software is the software whose source code is available for modification or enhancement by anyone. The definition of open source is that describing a broad general type of software license that makes source code available to the general public with relaxed over non-existent copyright uh, restrictions. So the open source become more and more popular because there are a lot of advan- uh, advantages of open source, like the open source has low cost, reliability, durability, security, freedom from like vendor locking. Like in the detail, like the open source software is free to use, distribute, and modify, and also open source is more secured as the code is accessible to anyone. For example, in the proprietary world, not so much. Microsoft, for example, typically take weeks, if not months, to patch uh, vulnerabilities, such as the recently discovered Internet Explorer zero-day flaw. Uh, Open source is not dependent on company or author that originally created it. Even the company feels the code continue to exist and be developed by its user. However, it also have some challenges. It is familiarity, like open source software generally does not focus on making user interface design uh, intuitive, which make it difficult for average computer user to learn and use it, due to which they prefer proprietary software. Also, it is lack of vendor support, legal issue, and lack of internal uh, technical skill. And right now we know the advantage and the challenges of open source. So are there any difference between the open source and free software? I think there are many people think open source and free software is the same thing, but it is not. Like me, before I didn't do the research of open source, I I will never know what is open source. But right now I know that to define the conditions, the free software is an open source only. That the definitions of free software is more stir, uh, uh, stringent than the open source. And open source software is not always freeware. Free software and open source totally different. Are different. They are different. Two different terms. Both open and closed source software can be available at no cost and hence be freeware. That's the difference. And open source software used to be undesirable, like uh, in constant quality and no secure, no supported, and but like technology has changed the landscape. Open source has become more reliable and effective. It also has a lot of opportunities like big data, mobile, and cloud. These are some products of open source. Like for example, the first one, like Firefox, it can be instead of like Google search website. I think Google software, and this is very important product of open source. Linux. I think it can be instead of Windows system, Windows, and it has some warranties and support. Software provides ASIS with no warranties. Warranties excluded, and no indemnification and no maintenance and our support. So this picture shows how closed source compared to the open source. This is picture show that. And I searched some survey for the open source. It shows like 78% of respondents said their companies ran part or of its operations on OSS, and 66% says they take an open source first approach to software, and 64% of companies currently participate in open source project, and over the next 2 or 3 years, 88% of companies are expected to increase contribution to open source project, and over the next 2 or 3 years, 88% are expected to increase contribute to open source project, and 55% believe open source delivers superior security compared to the proprietary solution. I think the survey shows that more and more people using the open source software, and it become more and more popular. That's why I think the world needs open source, and the world is open source. Finally, I think open source will continue to be an important part of the software landscape for the years to come. And in conclusion, this bit of content drawback our head debates over open source software. It continued to win the hearts of millions when it comes to computing. It will remain the future of software, become of the revolution it has brought into not only technical but our industries too. And that's all. Thank you for you following. Thank you.